Ya Alimada. Welcome to Critical Conversations, a discourse on spirituality with Dr. Azim Nanji and Dr. Farouk Mitha. On the occasion of Laylatul Qadr, ITREB USA is very pleased to hold this panel discussion between Dr. Nanji and Dr. Mitha, and I have the incredible honor and privilege of getting to introduce two remarkable humans and scholars. So I would like to start with Dr. Nanji. Dr. Nanji serves currently as the special advisor to the provost at the Aga Khan University and a member of the university's board's academic and student affair committee. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Global Center for Pluralism in Ottawa, Canada. Previously, Dr. Nanji served as senior associate director of the Abbasi program in Islamic studies at Stanford University and lectured on Islam in the Department of Religious Studies. He served as the director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London from 1998 to 2008. Within the AKDN network, he has served as a member of the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and the Aga Khan Award for Music. And it is a great privilege to have you. Dr. Nanji is an author and a co-author and editor of several books. He has contributed to shorter studies and articles on religion, Islam, and Ismailism in journals and collective volumes. Dr. Farouk Mitha teaches currently at the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria in Canada. He also is the course director at the Institute of Ismaili Studies for the Postgraduate Fellowship Program, prior to which he was the course director for the Secondary Teacher Education Program, or STEP, at the IIS. He has published in the areas of medieval Islamic thought, the state of liberal education in contemporary Muslim societies. He's teaching Shakespeare, Canadian literature, and Iranian cinema. Welcome, Dr. Mitha. Welcome, Dr. Nanji. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us and spending your time. We are grateful. I'd like to begin by asking a question about, as we celebrate this important night of Laylatul Qadr, from your perspective, what do you see as the significance of this night and the significance it holds in the spiritual journeys of individuals?
So I think the first point to make is that essentially the night symbolizes the founding moments of Islam and in a way inspires what will become the future civilizations and cultures within the Ummah. It is the night when Muslims believe revelations began. So in that sense, simultaneously, it's also a definition of the continuity of prophecy within the history of religions. And Islam enters, therefore, the history of the world. It enters because it continues a tradition that starts from time immemorial, but also it tries to build on that tradition and to be able to express in a different language, in a different milieu, and with the continuing source of divine inspiration, a revelation that we hear in the verses of Laylatul Qadr. And particularly for Shia and for Ismaili spirituality, I think it also constitutes the beginning of the vocabulary that is going to inspire those traditions and nurture them within the tariqas. I think particularly the concepts of ruh that speak to the spirit, the concepts of light that are so central to the beliefs of Shia as well as Ismaili Islam. And then also, I think, in particular, the notion of a history that's cosmic. So this is unfolding, as it were, against the backdrop of the cosmos, but it articulates the way in which the spiritual and the material connect.
Wow, that's wonderful, Professor Nanji, the way you've sort of wonderful canvas that you've laid out. And let me at the outset first thank you, Noureen, for your kind words, and wonderful to connect again. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be in this conversation with Professor Nanji, an esteemed teacher and a contemporary figure, a rather pioneering figure in contemporary Smiley studies. So this is a special honor for me. And I like, Professor Nanji, the way you laid out this big canvas. And in one sense, you know, when we talk about this larger history, we're all part of this larger history, all of us. And in a way, moving from the cosmic to the personal history, I think for all of us, we all have memories of Laylatul Qadr. And right from my childhood, I have these memories of coming to this special night. And it was clearly, even as a child, something that seemed out of the ordinary. Well, you know, a child doesn't stay up that late. But I really think when we talk about significance, we're always relating the personal to something larger. And in that sense, I think that autobiographical element is so rich, and it brings alive what this means for the community, because as we are together part of this community, I have vivid memories of the Mukhis, the Kamariyas, the Mukyanima, and the Kamarni Saibas nurturing and caring for us during these evenings. And of course, the Waizin, probably that's the time that we hear the most Waizis. And it's funny what I remember from those Waizis. Mostly, I think I remember the humor. But of course, in the volunteers, the tireless energy of the volunteers. But moving forward, clearly different layers of significance then emerge from me. And I think the one word that I think captures or resonates with me is the word invitation, that this night is an invitation. And it's right there in the Quranic ayat, in Surah Al-Qadr. You know, there's the voice almost of a teacher, a self-reflective teacher, when the Quran says, "Wa ma adraka ma Laylatul Qadr." And how shall we explain to you what is Laylatul Qadr? I mean, this is the incredible self-reflective voice in the Quran. And then it responds, Laylatul Qadr khayrun min alfi shahr. And you know, when you talk about 1,000 months, it's really the Quran is talking about a metaphor here of surpassing greatness, that it's something greater than 1,000 months. So on the one hand, it's an invitation to inquire, and then also it spurs on the imagination. And that to me, in a sense, is our quest. It's the quest that we carry within ourselves all the time, but it, in a sense, Laylatul Qadr becomes that beckoning of how we bring alive that quest. And, you know, it's interesting that the term Qadr in Arabic, it may seem simple. And, you know, if you look at the different translations of the Quran in English, you find people coming up with different translations of the word Qadr. I've seen, of course, power, the night of power, but also destiny or decree. And I think that is interesting for me because this night is about individual agency, the way in which Prophet Muhammad himself exercised that sense of Qadr this night, but it's also about divine grace. And it's in that whole, in a sense, very rich interplay between human quest and being open to divine grace that for me is another wonderful resonance of this night. And of course, you know, words begin to fail us when we talk about these dimensions and these categories. But I think this idea of grace and its connection to prayer is something that I think Professor Nanji, when he was talking about Ruh and light, I think these are different ways in which we personally make associations with our own sense of personal spirituality.
Thank you so much. I really loved how the two of you brought in both the perspective, the historical perspective, and how it impacts the individual. And what I'd love to hear a little bit more about is how do we look at Laylatul Qadr within this historical and cultural perspective throughout the history of Muslim culture and civilizations?
So let me pick up, I think, on one reference, I think, that Farouk made. I think the notion of ayat, we speak of the Quranic verses in the plural as being ayat, ayah in the singular. And ayah is also a reference to signs in nature. So we have a notion here where the signs of the verses is also a sign of nature. And it's particularly striking that across time and space, Muslim cultures have picked up on these notions to reflect them in the arts, in architecture, but also in literature and in other media. And I want to, because I feel I'm very fortunate that living in Toronto, I have access to the museum and the Ismaili Center. I want to pick up on the speech that Maulana Hazima made during the foundation laying ceremony of that complex. And I think it's important in the way in which it creates this notion of how light becomes a way in which buildings reflect the coming together of spirit and matter. He said, the Toronto Museum will take as its theme the concept of light, suffusing the building from a central courtyard through patterned glass screens. From the outside, it'll glow by day and by night, lit by the sun and the moon. This use of light speaks to us of the divine light of the Creator, reflected in the glow of individual inspiration and a vibrant, transparent community. And as the poet Rumi has written, the light that lights the eye is also the light of the heart. But the light that lights the heart is the light of God. And I think that notion of how that particular night mirrors the suffusion of light into both the cosmos, but into the hearts of individuals. And I think that's why culture through art or through architecture has utilized the idea of light to reflect on how that message is carried through as a sign across all creation. And I'm also particularly struck by the use of art objects within the museum that carry these themes forward. So we have the wonderful example of an leaf from the Ottoman period on which there is written a verse of the Quran in illuminated gold. And I think what we see there is nature upon nature, how the beauty of the calligraphy is captured on the leaf as a reflection of the continuing interaction of this notion of light and nature throughout the expressions of Muslim art.
Well, thank you, Professor Nanji. Again, there's such richness in what you're saying, and I'm thinking, how can I sort of build on that? Well, clearly, I love this idea that, of course, it's very, very fascinating, the use of the term ayat in the Quran. And as you mentioned, of course, reading it from the outside, we refer to it as the verses, but clearly it's also the signs of Allah, the ayatullah. And in a way, it's not only in nature, that not only is universe a text. I mean, that's the one implication that we get out of the Quran. But even when we think of humanity and the differences within humanity, those are seen as signs. And fundamentally, of course, when we talk about ourselves, the self in the Quran, they talk about signs within ourselves that we need to discover, anfusihim. So, I mean, that idea of this movement of reading the universe, the universal, if you will, the universal self, and reading the Atman, as we would say in Hindu thought, the innermost self, that there's a sense of connection. And I think that Rumi quote, moving from the eye to the heart, to the light of Allah, talks about this amazing sense of integrity and interconnectedness, that unity that always is, I think, a sign of all spiritual traditions. But I think as you were speaking, what struck me is that we are clearly always trying to find a language within which to express this. And this is, in Ismaili thought, that relationship between the Zahir and Batin. That in a way that if you can find the right language, it in a sense becomes a closure and one has to open it up again. Because to find the right sort of physical sensory expression is to still remain at the Zahiri level. And what does it mean to transcend? And I think what is very interesting is in contemporary Muslim societies, how receptive are Muslims today to this way of thinking? But as we see that really it's one voice among many, and if you look at the differences within the communities of interpretation, you actually find a certain type of outlook which is resistant to this. They actually see the Tasawwuf or the Sufis as threatening, or somehow is diluting something or taking something away. And I think if anything, we, the Ismailis, really stand for the complete opposite. And we have a contribution to make where the spiritual, the mystical, if you will, is not seen as something separate from how we think about religion or something somehow that we have to make a connection with, but it is the very nature of what it means to be a part of a faith community. And I think this is so important because really the idea of our own spiritual sensitivity, especially at a time like this, I think it's probably more urgent than it has ever been. Maybe every age thinks about its own urgency. But if you were to try and imagine the Prophet on this night, and what was in his mind? What was he, even from a point of view of trying to understand what were his aspirations? What was he seeking? Well, clearly we know that he sought out solitude, that he needed to be solitary for this aspiration, for this quest. He clearly needed to be in a place which was silent, going right to Mount Hira. And clearly it was a sacrifice that he had to make. And I think if you look at those three words, interestingly, they all start with the letter S, but what does solitude mean to us today, especially in this wired up world in which we live? How do we seek solitude? And where will we find silence? I mean, increasingly, silence has become a very precious entity. And what are we willing to sacrifice to realize these things in our ideals? And I think, these are very important parts of all spiritual traditions. And these are things that are always something that are never, one generation never completes that journey. It's every generation has to make that journey for itself and reawaken that sense of spiritual sensitivity. And I know many of you will be listening to many talks on Laylatul Qadr, or you've had by the time you listen to this conversation. And I would just say that I think the best and the most inspiring ways in which we can talk about this is ways in which we are inspired by questions rather than simple and tidy answers. And just to keep that quest alive. As I said, this whole movement that you have in all religious traditions between a more literalist as opposed to a more non-literalist view of scripture or interpreting scripture. I mean, that's, I think, one of the vital tensions in all faith communities today. And this night, in a sense, asks us to see how we think through that spectrum.
No, and it's also quite significant that as Muslims collected and recorded the Quranic text in writing and arranged the surahs, that the surah that precedes the one that we are reflecting on is Suratul Alaq, right? So the notion of the intellect and the notion of discovery through the intellect is also linked to the ideals of this night. And I think it's important to keep in mind that traditions that have emphasized the role of the intellect, that have tried to capture the inherent spirituality of Islam, have always left themselves with the possibility that you cannot treat knowledge as a closed book. Yeah. Knowledge is also something you are constantly discovering. And that discovery is part of your being human. Yeah. As you know, there's a fascinating debate in the Rasail Ikhwan Safa between human beings and animals and birds, and it's a debate about relative superiority. Yeah. And it ends in a way with the realization that human beings are endowed with a capacity of self-awareness, yeah, and self-reflection, yes, that permits the human race to receive God's blessings in a different way, yeah, through figures like the prophets and through a continuing divine communication. This is not to say that other creatures do not have linkages with the divine, yeah, but human beings have it in a special way, yeah, perhaps in a unique way. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we reflect on the importance of this night.
Yeah, I mean, that again that really resonates playfully. You know, I often say that I think what makes human beings unique is our power of storytelling. You know, there is this sort of glib statement that human beings are storytelling creatures. And I mean by stories, not something necessarily in terms of the imagination, our capacity to fictionalize, but really our need to make meaning and the ways in which we connect experiences with memories. And in a way, this night is centered on a narrative. It's a narrative of the prophet. And every generation of Muslims, in a sense, retells this narrative of what happened on this night. And as we retell it, we discover for every, you know, retelling this narrative today would be very different from even retelling it before COVID. And now it has new meanings for us. It has a new urgency. So when you're talking about signs, I think of what are the signs that we need to be alert to, especially in this time of extraordinary experiences that we're all facing, something that we took for granted, being able to go to Jamaat Khana. I now, in the future, won't take that for granted. But of course, in the Muslim tradition, you have the telling and the retelling first in the Quran, which is more oblique, and then you have much a fuller version in the Sirah, the biography of the Prophet, and some accompanying hadiths. And I think this idea of, you know, the idea is that it's almost, again, this connection between spiritual sensitivity, which is connected to aesthetic responsiveness. And, you know, the beautiful image that you talked about in that terms of the leaf and the gold, the gold lettering of the ayat. I mean, that's what, in a sense, we do with these powerful stories. We try and represent them in ways that can not only bring meaning to ourselves, but inspire others. And yeah, I think in many ways we can stretch the metaphor to say that this night is an invitation for us to write the next line in our story, in the story of our life, and in terms of where we're heading. And I think that's, I think that's what I take from what you're saying, Professor Nanji.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitha, Dr. Nanji. I really appreciate the short journey that you have given us through our history, and well as how can we take and learn from our past. One of the things that I'm really struck by is how our faith has so much to teach us about what has come before us. And how can we take what has happened and learn from that and be able to take the wisdom of the past and apply it to our present? And I'm wondering if the two of you would be able to share maybe some of the wisdom that you think that we can hold with us tonight as we reflect from your perspectives in these times.
I think if we take this particular moment, it is a moment which is very sobering in one respect, because there are forces that have been unleashed over which we cannot see ourselves having control. And it has created, I think, two significant, both opportunities but moments. One is that it has created a shared experience of having to encounter the pandemic, but also a shared experience of tragedy. For many, this is a period of despair, of despondency, of loneliness. And in those moments, we strive always to see if there is any meaning or any hope. And when I go to the verses of this particular night as they are expressed in the Quran, I'm heartened by the fact that while we are going through a dark period, a period where it is very difficult to decipher how particularities in our lives, in our societies might develop. But the hope is that we can rebuild our souls and our hearts. And I think in the midst of a time of tragedy, there is always the hope that there will be a dawn, that there will be peace.
And isn't that wonderful? I mean, that the Surah Al-Qadr ends with that reminder that, until the dawn, until the Fajr, that this night, will be of peace until the coming of the dawn. And I think that's so important in terms of what also makes us human, is our, I suppose, hopefulness, our resilience, and our optimistic, if you will, sort of capacity for optimism. Well, I would like to maybe quote some lines from Farouk Mitha, because I think in a way it probably caps together many of the different threads of this conversation. And I gather by the time you hear this conversation, there's been a reading of the Conference of the Birds from the selections in the secondary curriculum. And, the secondary curriculum has a very small selection of lines, I think maybe 600 lines. It's almost a 5,000 line poet by that remarkable poet, mystic, and doctor. He was a medical doctor and herbalist, Farouk Mitha, who lived in the 12th and 13th century. And these lines that I'm going to sort of just read out, they're very early on. Now, of course, many of you have heard about the Conference of the Birds. The very fact that it is about a journey of these thousands of birds who have a need to change something in their lives. And so the first important message for the Attar is trying to communicate is what brings us to a point where we feel we need a change, that we need to change our lives. What is that spur? Is it a midlife crisis? Is it a lack of satisfaction with where we are? And as Professor Nanji said clearly right now with what's happening with the COVID crisis, we're clearly thinking about how are we going to change post-COVID? How are we going to change our relationship to the natural world? How are we going to change our political arrangements and the ways in which we organize our economy? Well, similarly, you have these thousands of birds who have this need for change. And it's a poem that really, in a sense, traces their journey under the guidance of this bird, the hoopoe bird, or in the Quran, it's called the hudhud. And of course, it's an allegory. It's an allegory. So the guide is like, the hoopoe bird is like a spiritual guide, a murshid, and the birds are like murids. And they cross 7 valleys, and each one of these valleys reflects almost, I would say, a psychological condition: the valley of quest, the valley of love, the valley of bewilderment, the valley of unity, and the valley of poverty and nothingness. So in a way, he's talking about this, if you will, this set of ideals and virtues that we need to, in a sense, fully internalize. And the birds of the thousands that set out on this journey, only 30 complete the journey. And initially, of course, they were in the quest for the simurg. And Attar uses that as a pun, because we're thinking of a simurg as this divine creature which has a source of all these blessings and grace. But by the time they finish the journey, Attar breaks the word simurg into simurg, 30 birds. So in effect, really the whole allegory is about an allegory of self-knowledge, because the birds go out in quest for the simurg, who they think is outside themselves, only to realize that they are the simurg. They see their own reflection. And this idea of self-realization, self-knowledge, is right there in even the hadith of the Prophet. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. He who knows himself knows his Lord. And the lines that I'm quoting, in fact, interestingly, go back to what you were saying, Professor Nanji, about signs. And the lines are, it was in China, late one moonless night, the Simurgh first appeared to mortal sight. He let a feather float down through the air, and rumors of its fame spread everywhere. So if I can just stop there for a moment, this idea of the feather floating down and being visible to us, that to me is the sign that the Quran talks about, because it's the idea of sign. And in a way, as Attar continues, he makes it explicit. And he goes on to say, it is a sign of him. And in each heart, there lies this feather's hidden counterpart. That really we complete that feather, that we are one with that feather. But this is something that we need to realize. It is a sign of him, and in each heart, there lies this feather's hidden counterpart. But since no words of mine to represent or to describe this sign, whoever wishes to explore the way, let him set out. What more is there to say? Well, indeed, yeah, what more is there to say? I know, sometimes when we get talking about these matters, they become perhaps a bit more abstract. Louis Armstrong, your compatriot to all of you in America, had this wonderful line, don't say it, just play it. And I think that's also something that's central, that this stuff lies beyond language, but it requires a commitment, a life commitment. And I think that's so important. But let me also add that I hope that this night will provide many of you who are facing hardships and facing real challenges, that it may provide you comfort, a sense of perspective, peace, real peace, and also strength and hope. And to know that this too shall pass, that we will pass through this dark tunnel and hopefully come out better at the other end. As Rumi says, this too shall pass.
And to constantly remind ourselves when we look at a story like the Conference of the Birds, that there is unity at the heart of human existence, because we are all created from a single soul. But also there is pluralism. And it's through that pluralism that we discover the unity.
On this quest of spiritual search, you both have given us so much to reflect on. Thank you so much for your time. And I'd also like to thank the Jamaat for joining us in this conversation and on this journey with Ya Ali Madat.